So this is a really interesting museum. It's called Erawan Museum. Very few people probably come to see it because it's not located in a convenient place in Bangkok. And yet, it's got one of the most stunning introductions or entrances that you'll ever see in a museum. And that is a three-headed elephant made of mostly bronze. Now, the founder of this museum created it as a way of promoting peace. And he was saying that the Asian cultures are too preoccupied with material things, and the Western cultures are too preoccupied with war. And so as a result, we're losing our common humanity and what binds us together. Now, I've had a very difficult time trying to understand Eastern religions, Buddhism and Hinduism. That's been very difficult for me, but when I came here, it was a lot easier. And one of the reasons is because they actually explain it very well in English, what these stories represent. Now, the Buddha is apparently a collection of over 500 different stories. And the Buddha is reincarnated. And what's really happening there is that the Buddha comes back to teach people lessons, like life lessons, moral lessons, and in the form of stories, mostly about compassion, being nice to your parents, and so on and so forth. And so that makes a lot of sense. I didn't understand that until now, that all these stories were vehicles for teaching children and adults, just morality lessons. And this is also similar to see with Hinduism, where you have another situation where you're telling stories in order to teach morality. So that's an important thing to understand, number one. And number two, it's obvious that the stories overlapped over time as Hinduism and Buddhism began to experience each other through traveling missionaries and trade and everything else. And so you start to see a merger between Hinduism and Buddhism in Southeast Asia. And particularly here I shouldn't say Bangkok, but a bit north of here, Ayutthaya. And that's where you start to see similarities not only in Eastern religions, but also in Western religions. And you start to see that history is essentially a commingling of different missionaries and travelers incorporating their stories into yours in order to hopefully promote trade or some other sort of cultural understanding. So you'll notice that the songkok that the Malaysians wear, or sometimes the Indonesians, right, which is sort of a rectangular spherical hat, you think about it, it actually probably goes back to the Egyptians. You can notice that being copied as well, so you can probably, understand some sort of, cross-cultural exchange. You also notice here with the naga, which is essentially a snake that protects the king, or one of the kings, you see that's also similar to Medusa, with the snakes on the head. There are so many different similarities and commingling, it's difficult to go through all of them, but you also see with elephants. Why are elephants so revered? Well, first of all, they were warriors, they were used in war. And so you look at chess, the bishop in Western societies is actually the elephant. If you look at the old chess sets, is actually an elephant in Eastern chess sets. So it's really interesting how, again, you're essentially taking the same things, but modifying them locally. And what you also notice over time is that as we've begun to do that, or continue doing that, it's become more difficult because the digital world requires or demands or promotes a single standard. So whereas an analog world promotes cooperation, let's say you have a ceramic, somebody discovers the cobalt blue. And so suddenly what ends up happening is you don't have a single standard. The Dutch can make, perfectly fine ceramics and pottery using that blue color. They can modify it. They can try to experiment with, which types of, glazing methods work better, et cetera, et cetera. And that happens over, a period of time. And so you have different vases, different ceramics over a long period of time. You'll notice them being traded all over Europe, Asia, and everywhere else. And again, that's because the analog world does not demand a single standard. And so there's more room for people to be creative, despite the fact that, again, you're still commingling different ideas. The other interesting epiphany is, again, you go back, one of the foundational sort of understandings that you have to have as you travel and try to understand these different things, these different religions, is that the Abrahamic religions were supposed to be about law and order. So you have the Ten Commandments. You go into Islam, you have a very strict method of behavior, primarily because you're trying to incorporate a lot of former slaves into your network. And so you have to have a more stringent process if you're trying to do that, regardless of class, religion, well, perhaps not religion, I should say, but class, race, ethnicity, and so on. If you're trying to do all that, it has to be a more strict standard. Whereas if you're not trying to do that, let's say you have a storytelling function. It's a lot easier to create, for example, a caste system that says the Brahmins are at the very top and the Dalits are at the very bottom. It's easier to create that, especially in Catholicism, where you have a lot of racism that was used in order to justify chattel slavery. And no way, really, for those slaves to rise up and become equals at that point in time. So you go back and forth, and so you're looking at a sort of a clash, right, between these very strict law and order types, and you see that being mocked, right? You see, for example, in Shakespeare, Shylock trying to appeal for the law, trying to appeal for the contract, and he's Jewish, of course. And you see the Christians saying, well, there's something bigger than the law, and you have to look at the bigger picture. And that is, again, a manifestation of this clash between this idea of law and order and intellectualism, which really was promoted for the most part by the law and order. A lot of people were trying to create a merger between, say, science and belief, and faith and creativity. And you go back and forth, and you're looking at how these successful civilizations managed to do it. And every one of them, at least to the extent that they were successful, did manage to create some form of progress without antagonizing or trying to extinguish what came before them. So almost everyone copies, right? And so when you understand that, it should make it easier to get along with each other, because when you discover something new, you don't know where it came from. It could come, just because you think that, let's say you grow up in a Persian household, like I did, and you drink tea, and you notice all these beautiful samovars, but you don't, you haven't been yet exposed to Russian, and so the word samovar doesn't seem Russian to you. It seems Iranian or Persian to you as a 12-year-old, and yet you suddenly realize, as you gain more knowledge, that the Russians must have helped or given that to the Persians. But even that's not the end of the analysis, right? The other issue is that in many cases, because of the emissaries and intellectuals and academics going back and forth, a lot of times in order to promote peace, it wasn't just through marriage, it was through the acceptance of the other side's or visiting person's belief system. And you can sort of help promote peace or cultural relations by incorporating that person's stories or what designs into your own local structure. So a lot of the things that you see that you think were designed by, say, your people or your religion or your ethnicity may have been gained by an emissary from some place totally different. And what's important is that in the analog world, it's almost impossible to figure out who created what first, because so much of that creativity and commingling was happening. And, when it was happening so much, it was obviously, I suppose, it was obviously, in a sense, more successful than what we're seeing now, as more walls go up, both digital and analog, as more people become frustrated with immigration without realizing that globalization has always been with us, and therefore immigration along with it. As we move on towards this sort of AI, digital, sort of future, the idea that I think a lot of trading houses and banking systems and militaries have is that we can eventually extinguish the need for immigration, or at least control it on whatever terms that benefit the dominant powers in society at that time, and therefore perhaps create a more stable system. And yet, as you go back and you're looking at all of these different designs, and you're looking at a sort of a system where you have storytelling balancing out the often crudeness of a law and order society. You can see that within the Abrahamic religions very easily. You can see that, you had Judaism, which must have been very strict, otherwise you wouldn't have had a need for Christianity's more liberal storytelling function to come in. And then you can see that Christianity's storytelling function must have at some point failed, otherwise you wouldn't have had Islam coming in later, and essentially creating a merger of the two, with more emphasis obviously on the law and order side that was given to them by their Semitic cousins. You see that with the language as well, al, el, and so on and so forth. Ibn, bin, ben, so on. So, you have this idea that you've got to sort of get along to get ahead. And that's sort of been missing from the political discussions these days, in part because a lot of people just have decided that they either don't want to understand history properly, or that they've gained a better truth than their neighbors, when in fact it's all commingled. So you're not going to be able to understand your own truth without understanding somebody else's truth. Just like you're not going to be able to understand American history until you first understand European history. And so it's interesting that I got these sorts of epiphanies here, because again, this is supposed to be, as it says here, world's largest copper Erawan private museum for peace and humanity. So again, it's really interesting. I thought it was bronze, the elephant, but perhaps it's copper. It's right behind me here. And there you go. So as you're studying history, you have to understand it's always been a situation where we've commingled, where we've borrowed and stolen and copied, and we've done so in order to facilitate cultural understandings and peace. So what do you do when there's only a single digital standard that you want to protect because you've invested in it so much, and you're not really willing to give room for another digital standard to come in with its own informational conduits? That's really going to be the challenge of the 21st century, this idea of trying to take what was beneficial in the analog world and then trying to adapt a digital system that allows a lot of the benefits, or allows us to maintain most of the benefits that the analog world and just basic traveling and diplomacy used to give us.